The hook of that morning came without warning, a knock that didn't just hit wood, but shattered everything Ethan Carter believed about dignity. Because behind that door stood a woman whose name would rewrite his entire future in silence. Welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny, where stories of struggle, dignity, and unexpected hope come alive. Wishing you a joyful day filled with happiness, peace, and inspiration as we begin. Ethan Carter stood in front of the small rental house with a single worn suitcase at his feet, and his daughter Lily Carter clutching his jacket sleeve as the landlord coldly repeated that the eviction was final and the locks had already been changed, while neighbors pretended not to watch but couldn't look away from a man trying not to fall apart in public. The morning air in the quiet suburban street of Ohio felt heavier than usual, not from weather but from judgment, the kind that settles when people decide your story is over before you do. And Ethan kept his voice calm even as his hands tightened around the strap of Lily's backpack because he refused to let her see him break. Lily, only 8 years old, looked up at him with confusion rather than fear, asking softly if they were just going somewhere temporary. And Ethan forced a gentle smile he did not feel, telling her that sometimes life rearranges things, but it never removes what matters most, even though he had no idea where they would sleep that night. The landlord, a man who once greeted Ethan with forced politeness, now avoided his eyes completely as he handed over a final folded notice, explaining that business was business and the property had been sold to new ownership. And within minutes the front door clicked shut behind them with a sound that echoed louder than any argument Ethan could have made. He guided Lily down the front steps slowly, not because he was lost, but because he needed her to believe they were still in control of their pace, their story, their dignity, even as the reality of their situation settled like dust on everything they owned. A few passing cars slowed slightly, drivers curious but indifferent, the kind of silence that comes from people witnessing struggle without knowing how to respond, and Ethan simply nodded once to no one in particular, as if acknowledging that life had its reasons even when they were not visible. He loaded their few belongings into an old sedan parked by the curb, its engine already sounding tired, and Lily climbed into the passenger seat hugging a small stuffed rabbit that had survived every move they had ever made, while Ethan took one last look at the house that once held dinner conversations, laughter, and promises that now felt distant. As he turned the key, the engine coughed before catching, and for a moment he considered where to go, not because he lacked options entirely, but because none of them felt like home, and that was the real weight pressing on his chest. What Ethan did not know was that across town, in a glass tower that reflected the morning sun like a blade of light, Victoria Blake stood staring at a file with his name on it, her expression unreadable as she prepared to leave for a meeting that had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with timing. By the time Ethan reached the end of the street, the sky had begun to shift from gray to pale gold, and somewhere in that quiet transition between loss and what comes next, a black luxury car would soon appear at the edge of his world, carrying a future he was not prepared to understand. The road felt longer than it should have as Ethan Carter drove without a fixed destination, his hands steady on the wheel even though every mile carried the weight of uncertainty, while beside him his daughter Lily Carter pressed her forehead lightly against the window and watched the world pass in quiet confusion, asking where they were going as if the answers still existed in a clear and simple form. Ethan kept his eyes forward, choosing his words carefully, telling her they were heading somewhere safe and temporary, a place where they could think and plan their next step, even though he himself was quietly calculating how many nights they could afford in a low-cost motel before reality forced another decision. Eventually, he pulled into a small public park at the edge of town, where a few cars were scattered near the tree line, and the sound of distant traffic mixed with birds created a strange calm that did not match the storm in his mind. He turned off the engine, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if silence itself was asking them to accept what had just happened. Lily shifted in her seat and asked if losing a house meant losing everything, and Ethan turned slightly toward her, softening his voice as much as he could, telling her that a home is not a building, but the people who refuse to give up on each other, even when life changes suddenly. She nodded slowly, holding her small stuffed rabbit closer, and asked if he was sad, a question so direct that it made him pause longer than he wanted, but he answered honestly that he was. while also telling her that sadness does not mean the end of strength. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan stepped out of the car and leaned against the door, scanning the quiet park as if searching for a solution that would not require sacrifice. But every option he could think of carried consequences he was not willing to place on his daughter. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Blake stood inside the top floor of a glass office tower that overlooked miles of structured wealth and organized power, holding a thin folder that contained Ethan Carter's entire recent history, including financial records, eviction notice details, and employment gaps that painted a picture of a man quietly surviving without complaint. Her expression remained controlled, but there was a subtle tension in her gaze as she reviewed a single line in the report that confirmed he had refused financial assistance in the past, even when it was desperately needed, and that detail lingered in her thoughts longer than expected. An assistant entered the room briefly to confirm that her vehicle was ready, but she did not respond immediately, instead closing the folder and walking toward the window where the city looked like it was built on decisions made by people who never had to start over. She finally spoke, saying that sometimes the right person appears in the wrong moment, and sometimes timing is the only difference between collapse and renewal, before she turned away and instructed that the car be driven to the address listed in the file. As she descended into the private elevator, the reflection of her composed face faded into the glass, replaced by the quiet determination of someone preparing to step into a life far removed from boardrooms and negotiations. At the park, Ethan sat back into the driver's seat and checked on Lily, who had begun to draw small shapes in her sketchbook to pass the time, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to believe that stability might still be rebuilt piece by piece. But somewhere beyond the edge of that calm, a black vehicle was already moving through city streets with deliberate precision, carrying Victoria Blake closer to a man who had no idea his life was about to change direction once again. The afternoon light had begun to tilt toward a softer gold when Ethan Carter noticed the black vehicle easing to a stop along the curb near the park entrance, its presence immediately out of place among the ordinary cars and quiet families, and something in the way it moved suggested intention rather than coincidence. Lily Carter looked up first, lowering her sketchbook slightly as she followed her father's gaze, asking if someone was there to see them. But Ethan did not answer right away because experience had taught him that moments like this rarely came without complication. The car door opened with controlled precision and a woman stepped out, dressed in a simple but clearly expensive coat that moved slightly with the wind, her posture steady, her expression unreadable as her eyes scanned the park until they found him. Ethan instinctively straightened, not out of fear but out of habit, the way a person prepares for a conversation that might shift the direction of everything without warning. She walked toward them without hesitation, her heels pressing softly into the pavement, and the distance between them closed in a way that felt measured rather than accidental. Lily whispered her father's name, sensing the shift in energy, and Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder, signaling her to stay calm as the woman stopped a few feet away. For a brief moment, none of them spoke, and the silence felt intentional, as if each person was waiting to understand what the others would reveal without forcing it. Then the woman spoke first, her voice calm and deliberate, addressing Ethan by name, as if confirming a detail she already knew rather than asking a question. Ethan responded carefully, asking who she was and why she was there, keeping his tone respectful but guarded, and she introduced herself as Victoria Blake without offering unnecessary explanation, as though the name alone carried enough weight to define her presence. Lily looked between them, quietly observing, while Ethan listened as Victoria explained that she had reviewed his situation and that circumstances had brought her to him at a moment she did not believe was random. He frowned slightly, telling her he did not need charity or interference, and his words carried a firmness shaped by years of relying only on himself, even when that path was difficult. Victoria did not react immediately, instead glancing briefly toward Lily before returning her attention to Ethan, acknowledging his response without dismissing it, and stating that what she was offering was not charity but opportunity, though she did not yet define what that meant. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the sound of distant traffic into the park, and for a moment Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion settle deeper as he tried to interpret her intent without assuming the worst or hoping for too much. Lily tugged lightly at her father's sleeve and asked if the woman was going to help them, her innocence cutting through the tension in a way neither adult could, and Ethan knelt slightly beside her, telling her softly that they were only talking and nothing had been decided. Victoria watched this exchange closely, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she observed the way Ethan prioritized his daughter even in uncertainty, and something in her posture softened though she remained composed. She then stated that she had come because she needed someone like him for a situation that required trust, discipline, and integrity, qualities she believed could not be manufactured by wealth or influence. Ethan stood slowly, processing her words, asking what kind of situation required a man who had just lost his home, and Victoria replied that sometimes the people who have lost everything understand value more clearly than those who have not. The air between them tightened with that statement, not as conflict, but as recognition of opposing worlds intersecting for the first time, and Lily quietly stepped closer to her father as if anchoring herself to what was familiar. Victoria took a small step back, glancing once toward her vehicle before returning her focus to Ethan, stating that she would not pressure him for an answer immediately, but that walking away without hearing her proposal might mean losing something that could not be easily offered again. Ethan did not respond right away, his eyes briefly moving to Lily, then back to Victoria, as the weight of choice settled heavily in the quiet space between strangers whose lives had just begun to intersect in ways none of them fully understood. The park had grown quieter as the sun lowered further, stretching long shadows across the grass where Ethan Carter stood with his daughter Lily Carter still close to his side, while Victoria Blake remained a few feet away, maintaining a calm composure that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty in Ethan's expression as he waited for her to explain why she had come to a man who had nothing left to offer the world. The moment stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy with expectation, as if every second was measuring the difference between turning away and stepping into something neither of them fully understood. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice steady but lower than before, saying that she did not come to judge his circumstances, nor to question how he had reached this point, but rather to present an opportunity that required someone who understood responsibility without needing recognition. Ethan listened without interruption, his arms slowly crossing as a natural defense against unfamiliar authority, while Lily quietly observed the woman with the kind of curiosity children have when they sense importance but cannot yet define it. Victoria explained that she was overseeing a private redevelopment initiative involving multiple residential properties across the county, part of a long-term restructuring plan tied to community housing and transitional family support, and that one specific location within that project required a caretaker who could manage both structure and trust. Ethan frowned slightly, asking why someone like him would be considered for something connected to property development, and Victoria did not immediately answer, instead acknowledging that his recent eviction had been documented in the system she reviewed, though she stated it not as judgment, but as context for why she was standing in front of him now. The wind shifted again, carrying a cooler air through the park, and Lily moved a step closer to her father as Victoria continued, saying that the role she was offering included stable housing, financial independence, and long-term responsibility over a property that would otherwise remain unused. But more importantly, it came with a condition that could not be ignored. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, asking what kind of condition could accompany something that sounded too structured to be a gift, and Victoria met his gaze directly for the first time without hesitation, stating that the position required full commitment to rebuilding the property into a functioning residence for families in transition, and that whoever accepted it would need to live on site and treat it as something more than just employment. There was a pause after she finished speaking, the kind of silence that forces truth to settle without interruption, and Ethan looked down briefly at Lily, as if grounding himself in what mattered most before responding. He said that he did not trust offers that arrived immediately after loss, especially when they seemed designed to solve problems he had not asked strangers to solve, and his tone remained controlled but firm, shaped by years of experience relying only on his own decisions. Victoria acknowledged his hesitation without resistance, stating that she expected skepticism and would not insist on an answer in that moment, but added that she had learned over time that certain opportunities appear only once, and ignoring them often closes doors that cannot be reopened. Lily, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it. Asked softly if accepting would mean they would not have to sleep in the car again, and the innocence in her question shifted the atmosphere in a way neither adult could ignore. Ethan turned slightly toward her, taking a slow breath, and assured her that he would never let her live in uncertainty longer than necessary, even as he struggled internally with the reality that he had no immediate solution himself. Victoria observed this exchange carefully, her expression softening further as she recognized the weight of responsibility Ethan carried without complaint, and she finally added that the decision was not only about employment, but about rebuilding stability for people who had none, including himself if he chose to accept it. Ethan remained silent for several seconds, looking between the calm certainty in Victoria's stance and the quiet trust in his daughter's eyes, while the last light of day settled across the park, leaving them standing at the edge of a choice that would quietly determine the direction of everything that came next. The silence that followed Victoria Blake's last words did not feel empty but weighted, as if the park itself was waiting for Ethan Carter to decide whether his next breath would belong to the past or to something unfamiliar that was standing right in front of him, offering a path he could not yet clearly see. Ethan looked down at Lily Carter, who was holding her stuffed rabbit a little tighter now, her eyes moving between him and Victoria with quiet expectation, not pressure, only trust in the way children trust decisions they cannot yet understand. He slowly exhaled, then turned his attention back to Victoria, asking in a calm but firm voice what exactly she expected from him beyond what she had already explained, because experience had taught him that no opportunity came without hidden weight. Victoria did not hesitate, stating that she needed someone to oversee the daily operation of a residential property located outside the city limits, a place currently unused but structurally intact, intended for a transitional housing program she had personally funded. She added that the role required not only management but presence, someone who would live on site and ensure the property remained stable, safe, and functional for families rebuilding their lives, and that she had reviewed his background specifically because of his history of consistency even in unstable conditions. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, asking why she would place such responsibility in the hands of a man who had just been evicted from his own home, and Victoria responded with a calm certainty that made her words feel deliberate rather than persuasive, saying that losing stability did not eliminate the ability to restore it for others. Lily shifted her weight closer to her father, quietly listening as the conversation unfolded, while Ethan felt the complexity of the offer settle deeper into his thoughts, not as temptation, but as a responsibility that could reshape everything he was trying to protect. He asked about compensation, not because money defined his decision, but because survival required clarity, and Victoria answered without embellishment that the position included full housing, financial support, and legal responsibility over the property's operational decisions within defined limits. The wind moved through the park again, slightly stronger now, and Ethan turned his gaze briefly toward the distant road, as if searching for an answer that might appear without forcing him to choose too quickly. He then looked back at Lily, who asked quietly if the place Victoria mentioned would have a real bed and a place to stay together, and the simplicity of her question cut through every layer of hesitation he had been building. Ethan crouched slightly to meet her eyes, telling her that whatever happened next, he would make sure she was safe and that she would never feel abandoned, even as uncertainty still surrounded them. Victoria watched this exchange without interruption, her expression steady but noticeably softer than before, as if she was seeing not just a candidate for a role, but a man carrying the full weight of his responsibility without complaint. She finally stated that she would not force an answer immediately, but that the opportunity would remain open only for a limited time due to administrative requirements, and that she would need to proceed with another candidate if he declined. Ethan stood slowly, absorbing the reality that this was not simply a conversation but a narrowing path, and for the first time since the eviction, he felt the possibility of direction rather than drift. Lily reached for his hand, and he held it firmly, grounding himself in the only certainty he had left, while Victoria stepped back slightly, giving them space as the final light of the day faded behind the horizon and the moment settled into a quiet threshold between ending and beginning. The evening air had begun to cool noticeably as Ethan Carter stood beside Lily Carter at the edge of the park, the faint glow of streetlights beginning to replace the fading daylight, while Victoria Blake remained a few steps away, maintaining a composed silence that felt heavier now that the conversation had reached its most fragile point. Ethan kept his hand around Lily's, not tightly, but firmly enough to remind both of them that whatever direction life took next, they would not be separated by uncertainty, even if the ground beneath them was still unclear. He finally broke the silence, asking Victoria in a steady voice why she had chosen him specifically when there were clearly others with more stability, more resources, and more predictable backgrounds, because to him the choice still felt like a question without an obvious answer. Victoria took a moment before responding, her gaze briefly shifting toward the distant city skyline, as if organizing thoughts that were not meant to sound rehearsed. And then she explained that her initiative was not about selecting the most qualified on paper, but about identifying individuals who had demonstrated responsibility under pressure without external recognition. She stated that Ethan's recent history showed consistent employment patterns, stable parenting under financial strain, and a refusal to accept unearned assistance in the past, all of which aligned with what she considered necessary for the role she was offering. Lily listened quietly, her head tilted slightly as she tried to follow the conversation, while Ethan's expression remained guarded, processing the idea that his struggles were being interpreted as qualifications rather than failures. Victoria then added that the property in question was located approximately 30 miles outside the city, a structured residential complex with multiple units that required organization, maintenance coordination, and long-term oversight to transition into its intended community support function. Ethan asked what would happen if he accepted but failed to meet expectations, and Victoria responded without hesitation that accountability would be measured but not punitive, emphasizing that the goal was sustainability rather than perfection. The clarity in her voice created a different kind of silence between them, one that felt less like tension and more like a narrowing of possibilities toward a decision that would soon have to be made. Lily gently tugged at Ethan's sleeve again, asking if they would still be able to stay together if they went to this new place, and Ethan crouched slightly, assuring her that wherever they went, they would face it together, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Victoria observed this interaction carefully, her expression softening further as she noted the steadiness in Ethan's response despite his lack of certainty about the offer itself. She then stated that she understood the need for hesitation, but also reminded him that opportunities involving structured housing and financial stability for families in transition were extremely limited and often filled quickly through internal allocation. Ethan stood again slowly, glancing toward the road where passing cars continued their normal rhythm, contrasting sharply with the moment that felt anything but ordinary, and he asked for one clear confirmation that this was not a temporary arrangement designed to be withdrawn without notice. Victoria met his gaze directly and assured him that the position was contractual, structured, and intended for long-term implementation, not a short-term experiment, though she emphasized again that the final decision required his acceptance within a defined time frame. Lily looked up at her father with quiet expectation, not pushing him, but simply trusting him to choose what was best, and Ethan felt the full weight of that trust settle over him more than any financial uncertainty ever had. He finally exhaled slowly, acknowledging that while he did not fully understand the path being offered, he understood the absence of alternatives more clearly than ever before, and in that realization the silence between all three of them deepened into a moment that felt like the edge of a turning point neither could reverse. The silence between them had shifted again, no longer just hesitation, but something heavier, something closer to decision as Ethan Carter stood with Lily Carter at his side, while the last light of day slipped behind the horizon and Victoria Blake remained still, waiting without pressure, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already understood the direction this moment was heading. Ethan looked down at his daughter first, not because he doubted Victoria's words, but because every choice in his life now had to pass through the filter of her safety and stability before it could be considered anything else. Lily did not speak. She only held his hand and looked up at him with trust that carried more weight than any contract or offer ever could, and that simple presence made the world feel both smaller and more urgent at the same time. Ethan finally turned back to Victoria and asked in a calm but deliberate tone what exactly would happen if he accepted right now. not in theory or explanation, but in real terms starting from the next morning, because uncertainty had already cost him too much to accept more of it without clarity. Victoria nodded once, acknowledging the question as valid, and explained that acceptance would initiate immediate relocation support, temporary housing access within 24 hours, and a structured transition process to move him and his daughter to the assigned property within the week. She added that transportation, documentation, and financial stabilization would be handled through her office directly, but emphasized again that the role required full engagement and physical presence at the property once transition was complete. Ethan absorbed each word carefully, his expression steady but visibly processing the implications, while Lily quietly asked if they would still be able to keep her school notebook and drawings, a question so simple it momentarily softened the tension between the adults. Victoria responded gently that personal belongings were never part of the transition, and that stability included preserving what mattered most to them, which eased Lily's concern but deepened Ethan's internal conflict in a different way. He stepped slightly away, running a hand through his hair as he looked toward the empty park bench nearby, as if trying to separate emotion from logic in a situation where both were fully intertwined. Victoria did not interrupt him, instead allowing space, her posture unchanged but her attention fully present, as if she understood that pressure would only push him further away from a decision that required trust rather than force. Ethan finally spoke again, stating that he had spent years building his life on self-reliance, and that accepting something like this felt like crossing into a world he had no map for, but also admitting that continuing without stability for Lily was no longer a choice he could justify. Lily stepped closer to him at that moment, wrapping both arms around his side without saying anything, and that silent gesture seemed to resolve something within him more than any argument could. He looked at Victoria and asked one final time if this offer was real, not temporary, not conditional on hidden expectations beyond what had been stated, and Victoria answered with a steady certainty that it was structured, documented, and designed for long-term implementation rather than short-term intervention. The wind moved lightly through the park as Ethan stood there for a long moment, the weight of everything he had lost and everything still possible pressing against the same point in time. And finally, he exhaled slowly, looking down at Lily before returning his gaze to Victoria and saying that if this truly meant a stable future for his daughter, then he would accept the opportunity. Victoria gave a slight nod, not of triumph but of confirmation, as if acknowledging a decision that would quietly shift all their lives forward. And in that moment the space between them no longer felt like uncertainty, but like the beginning of something none of them could yet fully see. The moment Ethan Carter finished speaking the word acceptance, the air between them changed in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, but deeply undeniable, as if the decision had quietly closed one chapter of his life and opened another that none of them could fully visualize yet. Lily Carter looked up at her father with relief that she did not try to hide, her small fingers still wrapped around his hand, while Victoria Blake gave a slight, controlled nod as though confirming an internal process rather than celebrating a victory. For a few seconds, no one spoke, and the park around them continued its ordinary rhythm, distant cars passing, wind moving through the trees, and the fading light marking the end of a day that now carried a different meaning. Victoria finally broke the silence, stating that arrangements would begin immediately and that a transport vehicle would arrive within the hour to take them to temporary accommodations, emphasizing that the transition had been prepared in advance to avoid unnecessary disruption. Ethan listened carefully, not interrupting, but his expression showed a mixture of caution and realization that the speed of change was far greater than anything he had experienced before. Lily asked quietly if they would be leaving tonight, and Ethan knelt slightly, assuring her that they would go wherever they needed to together, maintaining a calmness he did not fully feel but knew she needed to see. Victoria stepped slightly aside and made a brief call on her phone, speaking in a measured tone that confirmed logistics, timing, and confirmation of arrival, her professionalism reinforcing the reality that this was no longer a conversation but a transition already in motion. When she ended the call, she returned her attention to Ethan and informed him that everything was being handled according to protocol and that he would not need to manage any immediate administrative concerns. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of relinquishing control over details he had always been forced to handle himself, from housing to transportation to basic stability. As they waited, Lily leaned closer to her father and asked softly if this meant they would have a real room again, and Ethan paused for a moment before answering that yes. For now, they would have a place to rest without uncertainty. The simplicity of that statement carried more emotional weight than anything else spoken that day, and for a brief moment Ethan allowed himself to feel the exhaustion he had been suppressing for too long. Victoria observed them quietly, her expression composed but no longer distant, as if witnessing not just an agreement, but the beginning of a fragile rebuilding process. The sound of an approaching vehicle soon reached them from the road nearby, subtle at first, and then clearer as it turned into the park entrance, confirming that the transition had officially begun. Ethan looked toward the sound, then back at Lily, then finally at Victoria, who gave a single confirming nod that everything was proceeding as promised. As the vehicle came into view, Ethan instinctively tightened his hold on his daughter's hand, not from fear, but from the instinct to ensure that whatever came next would not separate them. And in that quiet moment before movement resumed, the weight of uncertainty began to shift into something closer to reluctant hope. As the vehicle rolled into the park entrance and came to a smooth stop under the fading evening sky, Ethan Carter felt a quiet shift in the air around him, not dramatic or sudden but steady, as if the life he had known was being gently guided into a new direction without resistance. While Lily Carter held his hand tightly and watched the car with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. The driver stepped out first, confirming their names in a respectful tone before opening the rear door, and Ethan instinctively guided Lily closer to him, not out of fear, but out of habit formed from years of protecting her from uncertainty. Victoria Blake remained nearby, observing without interference, her presence steady and composed, as if ensuring that the transition she had initiated would proceed exactly as planned. Ethan helped Lily into the vehicle first, making sure she was comfortable before stepping in beside her, and for a moment he paused before fully settling into the seat, looking back toward the park where only hours earlier he had been standing with no direction at all. Victoria gave a final nod, signaling that everything was in place, and then she stepped back slightly as the door closed gently, enclosing Ethan and Lily in a space that felt unfamiliar but secure. As the vehicle began to move, Lily pressed her face lightly against the window, watching the familiar streets of their recent struggle fade into distance, while Ethan sat quietly beside her, his hand resting over hers, as if anchoring both of them to the present moment. The city lights gradually replaced the dim park surroundings, and with each passing mile Ethan felt the weight he had been carrying for months begin to loosen, not because his problems had disappeared, but because he was no longer facing them alone in the same way. Lily eventually asked if they were going somewhere far, and Ethan replied softly that they were going somewhere new, where they would have time to rebuild without rushing, and she accepted his answer with a quiet nod before leaning slightly against him. Victoria's voice came through a small communication device from the front, confirming that their destination was approximately 30 miles outside the city limits, and that all arrangements at the property had been finalized in advance, ensuring that no additional decisions would be required upon arrival. Ethan acknowledged the information with a simple response, though his thoughts remained focused on what this change truly meant, not in logistical terms, but in the deeper reality of rebuilding a life from uncertainty. As they left the city behind, the density of buildings gave way to open stretches of road lined with scattered lights, and the atmosphere inside the vehicle grew calmer, almost reflective, as if all three individuals were silently adjusting to the significance of what had just begun. Lily eventually fell quiet, her eyes growing heavy as the motion of the vehicle soothed her into rest, and Ethan gently adjusted her position so she could sleep comfortably against him. He looked down at her for a long moment, recognizing that despite everything that had been lost, this moment of safety was something he had fought for in every decision he had made. When the vehicle finally turned onto a quieter road leading toward the property, the surroundings became less urban and more open, with silhouettes of trees and distant structures emerging under soft lighting that suggested space rather than confinement. The vehicle slowed as it approached a gated entrance, and Ethan straightened slightly, observing carefully as the gate opened smoothly without interruption, revealing a well-maintained path leading deeper into the property. Victoria's voice came once more, calmly stating that they had arrived and that the transition was now complete, while Ethan looked out at the space ahead and realized that for the first time in a long while, the future was no longer defined by loss, but by the possibility of rebuilding. He gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder as she stirred slightly, then looked forward again as the vehicle came to a complete stop, and in that quiet final moment before stepping into a new chapter, Ethan understood that while nothing about the past had changed, everything about what came next had already begun to shift towards something closer to stability, dignity, and a second chance that neither he nor his daughter had dared to expect. Thank you for watching until the end of this story. If this journey touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us how you felt. Do not forget to subscribe to Poor Girl's Destiny for more powerful stories of hope, dignity, and second chances that will inspire your day.